On the morning of 25th November 1940, Haifa harbor looks ordinary from the British offices above the quay. In a room with flaking paint, a clerk folds a deportation list for a ship called Patria and smooths the crease with his thumb, making the names lie flat. Outside, cranes swing. Gulls cut across the light, and a launch moves toward the anchored liner that is scheduled to carry nearly 2,000 illegal immigrants away to Mauritius. On the deck, laundry lines and prams make the old ship look more like a crowded tenement than a deportation transport. Below the waterline, in a compartment few notice, a small charge has already been fixed to the inner hull by a man whose employment form describes him as an assistant in the repair team. At 9 o'clock, the harbor soundscape is still routine. Whistles, engines, voices, at the moment the ship begins to tear open. Later, some will call it a success. Most of those who were there never did. By early November 1940, Haifa Harbor, under the British mandate, runs on schedule. Cranes move in slow arcs, winch chains clatter, and in a second-floor office overlooking the quays, a duty sergeant rolls a fresh sheet into a typewriter to register illegal immigrants arriving on ships like the Pacific and the Milos. The room smells of ink, sweat, and hot metal files. A clerk takes a carbon copy of an immigration sheet, folds it twice, and slides it into a manila folder marked Detention, Atlet. That small gesture, lining up the paper edges, is the first appearance of a motif that will shadow this entire story. Paper as control. Down on the pier, refugees who have already survived river barges and months at sea wait in the haze. Their names, birthplaces, and ages become columns on forms that define them as a logistics issue, not an emergency. The 1939 White Paper, drafted in London, limited Jewish immigration to Palestine to 15,000 per year. For the clerks in Haifa, the paper was policy. For those waiting on the docks, it was a sentence. British immigration forms from those weeks record the same notations again and again. Detained, transferred, pending deportation. In the same building, an intelligence file notes the arrival of several hundred Jews from Bratislava and Danzig. Their passage arranged by unnamed intermediaries. Decisions taken in distant offices reduce lives already fractured by persecution to lines on a page. On that page, no one writes down the fear that hangs in the air. Within 3 weeks, a different set of hands will begin folding paper in Tel Aviv and deciding that ink alone is no longer enough. The story steps back to late 1938 in Paris and Tel Aviv. In rented offices and safe apartments, a clandestine apparatus takes shape. Mossad Le'Aliyah Bet, an underground structure inside the Haganah devoted to organizing illegal Jewish immigration in defiance of British policy. The organization's name translates roughly as the Institution for Immigration B, the second, unofficial track. In Paris, a senior organizer named Shaul Avigur studies shipping schedules and river charts, marking them in pencil on thin paper maps. In Tel Aviv, the political department of the Jewish Agency files memoranda describing the White Paper as a death sentence for those still trapped in Europe. These are paper bridges between continents. By October 1940, these same networks are deeply involved in moving refugees aboard the Pacific, Milos, and Atlantic. They purchase ships, contract captains, and accept desperate compromises with Nazi emigration offices to move people out. The British, reading their own reports, fear enemy infiltration and insist on rigid control. A security assessment from that autumn warns of Zionist underground activity in the port, noting that certain dock workers may have dual loyalties. Internal Jewish Agency correspondence from the same period speaks frankly of the stakes. If the deportations proceed, Europe's Jews will be abandoned to their fate. Two bureaucracies now face each other, one legal, one clandestine. Both rely on stamped paper, and both claim to act in the name of protection. On 20 November 1940, a single signature in the High Commissioner's office will force the underground to move from paper to explosives. The networks that once forged transit documents will now draft something far more dangerous. On 20 November 1940 in Government House, Jerusalem, the British High Commissioner, Sir Harold McMichael, signs a deportation order transferring roughly 1,800 illegal immigrants from the refugee ships in Haifa to the requisitioned liner Patria, destined for Mauritius. The document's language is neutral, almost bland. Transfer, embarkation, destination. Back in Haifa on the 21st and 22nd of November, clerks copy passenger lists from the Pacific and Milos and prepare to move people aboard the Patria. In the same days, a small group of Haganah and Jewish agency leaders meet in a cramped room in Tel Aviv. Among them are Yitzhak Sada and Moshe Sharet. Their notes record a decision. The deportation must be stopped by disabling the ship. The plan they approve is clear in its limits. A small charge placed against the hull would damage the ship enough to keep it in port without causing casualties. The objective is pressure, not blood. On a single sheet of paper, someone sketches the outline of a hull and circles a point just above the waterline. A first device is prepared and set for 22 November at 2100 hours. It fails. In the harbor night, the Patria remains intact, and the deportation timetable remains unchanged. An internal Haganah note from those hours records the failure in terse language. Device did not detonate. Cause unknown. Second attempt authorized. The gap between intention and capability appears in the silence of that first failed blast. On paper, the plan still looks clean. With the ship's departure imminent, the underground will risk a second attempt, this time with a stronger bomb and less room for error. By 23 November 1940, the Patria has become the center of the harbor's geometry. Built in 1913 as a French passenger liner, named for the Latin word meaning fatherland, she was later seized by the British and requisitioned as a troop ship. She was designed to carry around 800 passengers comfortably. She now holds more than twice that number in her cabins and corridors. From the quay, she looks solid, almost reassuring. But technical notes and later investigations describe an aging hull and weakened superstructure, patched and stressed by years of service. The camera of memory moves along plates flecked with rust, lingering on lifeboats that are too few for the numbers aboard. In a port workshop nearby, a man officially listed on employment records as an assistant in the repair team sits over a folded plan of the ship's cross-section. This is Munya Mardor, a Haganah operative inside the harbor workforce. His fingers trace the line where a charge might deform steel without tearing it apart. Mardor, born in Tel Aviv in 1913, had joined the Haganah as a teenager and risen through its ranks to become a trusted operative. His cover at the port was unremarkable. A young man with mechanical skills, willing to work hard. He writes brief placement instructions on a small sheet. Location, timing, estimated effect. The page is folded once, passed, and later destroyed. The motif reappears. Paper as calculation. To British officers, the ship is tonnage and capacity. To the saboteur, she is thickness of plate and floodable compartments. Neither set of figures includes the emotional weight of who sleeps below deck. While the operative studies metal and stress lines, families are being moved aboard as if the ship were safe. Between 21 and 24 November 1940, refugees from the Pacific and Milos are transferred to the Patria, and on the 24th, passengers from the Atlantic join them. Cabin lists fill. Families share bunks meant for one. Corridors become sleeping areas. The air inside is heavy with sweat, damp clothes, and engine vibrations. A passenger list is updated in a harbor office. Names, ages, notations of nationality. To the British administration, these people are deportees en route to an Indian Ocean colony. To their own underground, they are ma'apilim, illegal immigrants whose presence challenges policy. Among them are young people like Egon Weiss, whose later diary pages capture fragments of the day. He describes the bustle of boarding, rumors of where they will be sent, the uneasy comfort of finally being in sight of the Palestinian shore. His notebook entries, written in careful handwriting, become one of the few personal records of the experience. One passage reads, "We can see the mountains from the deck. Some people wept. On the pier, a British officer flips through the latest list to verify numbers against lifeboat capacity. The math does not add up. The Patria carried lifeboats sufficient for her original passenger complement, not for the nearly 2,000 now aboard. The page edges are already frayed from handling. Harbor logs from those days note routine inspections and supply deliveries, all proceeding as if the voyage were any other. Bureaucracy treats these people as units to be counted, moved, and offloaded. For the underground, they are the reason to take a risk that cannot be fully controlled. As the last launch pulls away on the evening of 24 November, another small boat approaches the Patria, carrying something that will decide all their fates. On the night of 24 November 1940, under basic blackout rules, the harbor cranes stand dark against the sky. A small harbor craft moves discreetly alongside the Patria. On board are port workers and one man carrying a burlap-wrapped object that looks like ordinary equipment. Inside the ship, in a restricted area near the inner hull, the object is opened. A shaped explosive charge with a simple time delay mechanism. The instructions, copied earlier from the Haganah planning sheet, are clear. Place the charge in a way that will rupture the hull enough to let in water, forcing the ship to be declared unseaworthy. The timing is set to 9 o'clock the next morning, chosen because most passengers are expected to be on deck rather than in lower cabins. Mardor later wrote in his memoir that the explosive was calculated for a controlled breach, enough to flood compartments gradually, not enough to destroy the ship. The operative secures the device, glances once at the bulkhead, and leaves without ceremony. In later accounts, he will stress the intention: disable the ship, avoid loss of life. The motif appears again in the burnt remnants of a note flushed down a latrine or reduced to ash in a tin can. Once the paper is gone, only memory and outcome remain. The charge contained approximately 50 kilograms of explosive, a quantity the planners believed would create a manageable hole. They did not know the hull was weaker than specifications suggested. Intelligence work relies on estimates of explosive force, of hull strength, of human behavior on deck. None of these can be known with certainty in advance. At 9 o'clock on 25th of November 1940, those calculations will meet steel, water, and human bodies in a way no one in that room fully anticipated. At 9 o'clock on 25 November 1940, the routine sounds of Haifa Harbor, whistles, shouted commands, winch motors, are torn apart by a single violent shock. Witnesses later describe a dull boom, a shudder through the ship, and then the Patria beginning to list sharply to port. From the British offices above the quay, officials rush to the windows as the liner appears to lift out of the water and then begin to settle. Her side torn open by a blast far stronger in effect than intended. The hole was larger than planned. Water floods lower compartments where many refugees are still gathered. Some were below deck collecting belongings. Others had not yet been called for the morning assembly. Lifeboats jam in their davits, unable to be launched in time due to the increasing list. On deck, people scream, jump, and cling to anything within reach. Nearby, naval and civilian boats race toward the ship, pulling survivors from the oil-streaked water. The harbor erupts into chaos. Whistles, engines, human voices calling names. From the first shock to the point where the Patria settles on the harbor bottom with her superstructure still partly above water, roughly 16 minutes elapse. British naval reports record the timeline with clinical precision. Detonation at 1900, severe list by 1905, hull contact with bottom at 1916. On the quay, a British officer grabs a damp passenger list, trying to mark off names of those he sees pulled ashore. The paper buckles in his hands. From the standpoint of planning, 16 minutes is an outcome. For those trapped below, it is an eternity of panic compressed into a few lines in an after-action report. As the smoke clears, the work of counting the living and the dead begins. By afternoon on 25 November 1940, Haifa's quays are lined with bodies and survivors wrapped in blankets. Temporary aid stations are set up in warehouses and on the pier itself. Hospitals fill. The official tally will harden over days, approximately 267 dead, according to British records, though some sources suggest the number was higher. More than 100 were injured. The majority of casualties were among the refugees the operation intended to protect. Clerks move along hospital corridors with clipboards, trying to match names from passenger lists to the wounded and the unidentified dead. Some names are never definitively attached to a body, others are recorded with wrong birthplaces or ages. The paper record, once so precise, begins to fray under the stress of reality. Harbor officials count 50 bodies recovered from the water on the first day alone. In the cemetery on the slopes of Mount Carmel, rows of fresh graves appear, many marked only by numbers at first. Later, stones will be inscribed. But on the day of burial, the emotional weight rests on those who must recite names and say they did all they could. A burial register in Haifa fills with new entries, each one linked to a specific plot in the ground. The motif shifts from control to consequence. One entry reads simply, female, approximately 30 years, no identification recovered. Medical staff work through the night. Ambulances shuttle between the harbor and the hospitals. Simple wooden coffins are brought from a depot that had expected to supply civilian funerals, not a mass casualty event. The line between operation and tragedy is measured here in rows of graves. The file name might remain Sabotage, but those who write in these ledgers are documenting something closer to disaster. In the weeks after the sinking, late 1940 and early 1941, the Patria's tilted superstructure remains visible in Haifa Harbor, a constant reminder for anyone working on the docks. The ship rests on the shallow bottom, her funnels and upper works protruding from the water like a monument. Among the laborers who continue to report for duty is the same man who placed the charge. Employment records still list Mardor under his cover role in the port repair team. He shows up on time, carries tools, and answers to supervisors like any other worker. His most subversive acts now are not sabotages, but acts of concealment, not flinching at rumors, not reacting to the sight of divers bringing up bodies. He later wrote that the days after the sinking were the hardest of his life. Walking past the wreck each morning. Inside Haganah's circles, a quiet internal investigation begins. Technicians and commanders examine what went wrong. estimates of the ship's condition, the choice of explosive amount, the timing. Their report concludes that the ship's weakened structure and overcrowded conditions made the blast far more destructive than their planning models had assumed. The hull plating was thinner than pre-war specifications indicated. The compartments flooded faster than any scenario had predicted. The motif returns as a thin, typed internal report, read, and then locked away. In its margins, someone has underlined a phrase about misjudgment. The operative's cover survives. His sense of certainty does not. From this point on, every shift in the harbor comes with the knowledge that his hands helped cause what he now watches. Outside the underground's closed rooms, competing public stories about what happened to the Patria begin to circulate. In the days and months following 25 November 1940, British officials issue statements describing the sinking as the result of sabotage, without naming the perpetrators. Press reports speak of a terrorist act, and speculation moves from one underground group to another. For years, many outside circles assume a more radical organization was responsible. The Irgun, a rival militant group, is mentioned in some reports. The Haganah's involvement remains concealed. At the same time, a decision is taken that the surviving refugees will not be deported to Mauritius after all. On humanitarian grounds, and under the pressure of public outrage, they are allowed to remain in Palestine. Colonial Secretary Lord Lloyd announces the decision in Parliament on 27th November, citing the trauma of the survivors. In parliamentary debates later in the war, the Patria will be mentioned primarily in this context, as a turning point in the handling of illegal immigration. In the Yishuv's own newspapers, the tone shifts over time from mourning to political argument. Articles reference the sinking as a symbol of British callousness, without revealing the internal role of the mainstream underground. Headlines speak of British cruelty and refugee martyrdom. The motif appears in the form of printed columns, bound into volumes of parliamentary proceedings and old newspapers. Public narratives that fix the story in particular frames. 1. One Yishuv newspaper editorial from early December asks, "Who killed them? The hand that placed the charge, or the policy that made the charge necessary?" The question receives no public answer. Once an event enters the public record, it becomes a tool in larger arguments. The reality in the harbor that morning shrinks to a few paragraphs of political positioning. Meanwhile, those who survived the water and the bureaucratic decisions find themselves once again behind barbed wire. In December 1940, many of the Patria survivors are transferred to the Atlit detention camp south of Haifa. The camp's architecture, long barracks, watchtowers, wire fences, repeats patterns they thought they had left behind in Europe. Daily life becomes roll calls, ration lines, and waiting for news. Others, particularly passengers from the Atlantic who were not on the Patria at the time of the explosion, are deported to Mauritius in early December 1940. Their ship journey continues past Suez into the Indian Ocean, ending not in the land of Israel, but in a tropical island prison under British guard. Approximately 1,580 refugees from the Atlantic reach Mauritius, where they will remain interned until the war's end. Camp records from Mauritius describe outbreaks of disease, marriages and births in exile, and a population living in limbo. The camps on that island would see 124 deaths before liberation. In Atlit, a refugee sketches the outline of the tilted Patria from memory in a small notebook. The drawing shows the ship listing, smoke rising, tiny figures in the water. In Mauritius, someone writes the ship's name in a diary, followed by the word sank and a date. The motif reappears as camp registration cards. Lines filled in by officials, sometimes misspelling the names of those who survived one mass drowning only to be held again. A Mauritius registration card for a Czech refugee lists previous vessel as Patria, sunk. The operation did, in a sense, change policy. Many of those who might have been deported were allowed to stay. But for those trapped behind wire or on distant islands, the line between rescue and abandonment never feels clear. Inside the political leadership that authorized the operation, the Patria becomes a painful topic, one often mentioned in private and almost never acknowledged in public. By 1945, as the war nears its end, internal discussions in the Yishuv's political parties and Haganah leadership occasionally turn to the Patria. Some party newspapers criticize the sinking in abstract terms, referring to a malicious hand without knowing or admitting who that hand belonged to. The publication of such a phrase triggers outrage among those who know the details. Senior figures close to the planners react defensively. One account from Yishuv political circles recalls a party leader's son confronting and slapping the editor who had allowed the condemnation into print. The gesture is as much about protecting the myth of the movement as about the operation itself. Internal memoranda and meeting notes show a divide. Some argue that the Patria was a tragic but necessary act of resistance against a policy that condemned European Jews to death. Others see it as a reckless miscalculation that should never have been attempted. A 1946 internal Haganah assessment reportedly uses the phrase disproportionate outcome relative to operational intent. On a table at one such meeting lies a thin folder labeled with the ship's name, containing the internal investigation and correspondence. The paper is worn at the edges, from being handled by many hands and kept from many eyes. Movements that rely on moral certainty to sustain their struggle often have the least space for acknowledging their own failures. Silence hardens into doctrine. For 12 years after the sinking, no public account attributed the Patria sabotage to the Haganah. The British suspected, intelligence files suggest, but never proved. The Yishuv remembered, but never spoke openly. That silence will begin to crack only when one of the central operatives decides to publish his own account of what happened in the harbor that morning. Through the 1950s, the wreck of the Patria remains partially visible in Haifa harbor, its corroding hull a constant, if unspoken, monument. Photographs of the waterfront show the tilted superstructure in the background of everyday scenes. Fishermen mending nets, cargo handlers loading crates, families on the promenade watching ships come and go. In 1952, the wreck is finally scrapped and removed. A physical piece of the story disappears beneath the cutter's torches. The harbor returns to its ordinary rhythms. A few years later, in 1957, Munya Mardor publishes a memoir of the illegal immigration struggle, titled Strictly Illegal. For the first time in a widely available book, a central participant states that it was the Haganah that placed the bomb on board, and that the aim was to disable the ship, not sink her. The admission is quiet, almost clinical. Mardor writes, "We wanted to delay the departure, not cause a catastrophe. From that point on, historians, journalists, and descendants of those involved rework the narrative. Some frame the Patria as a tragic miscalculation made under intolerable pressure. Others see it as unforgivable. Commemorations at the Haifa cemetery and in Mauritius mark anniversaries, reading the names of those who died in a mission that was never meant to kill them. The motif completes its arc in a modern archive, where two documents might rest on the same table: a refugee's sketch or diary page describing the sinking, and a worn copy of the operative's memoir. Between them lies the irreconcilable distance between intent and impact. By the time the last eyewitnesses pass, what remains are pages and stones, records that can be read, interpreted, and reinterpreted, but never made to undo what happened in those 16 minutes in Haifa Bay. Each time the story is told, someone returns to the same question. How many lives can you risk in the hope of changing a policy written on paper? The question hangs in fluorescent-lit archives, where staff members, wearing thin gloves, open boxes and lift out typed British cables discussing the Patria incident in detached language, alongside diary pages from refugees who wrote about seeing the ship twist and break before the words trail off. Outside, the view from an archive window takes in Haifa Harbor. Ferries come and go, cranes move containers, gulls wheel over the water. There is no visible trace of a ship that was meant to be merely delayed. The last gesture echoes the beginning, a hand gently closing a file so the pages sit perfectly aligned. This time, it feels less like control, more like an attempt to live with something that can never quite be put away.